this still a normal day at the office?
What does that mean exactly? You think that's what he's trying to do? Why are we learning this now?
Is that weird? Why is this happening? Why is that? Why is that? Why is that? Buckle up, stay with us. Happy to have you with us. Burgess Everett is a reporter for Politico.com. He covers Congress. And out of all the beat reporters in national politics, dedicated congressional reporters are often the most fun to watch. And that's because of the sort of breadth of their beat. Sometimes in Congress, they are covering gigantic stories of national significance and even potentially international significance, like confirmation hearings for a new justice for the United States Supreme Court. Sometimes they're covering, the biggest story you can imagine. But even when there isn't a huge earth-shaking story happening like that in Congress, congressional beat reporters still have to be there in Congress, covering whatever is happening on any given day. So yeah, today, a reporter like Burgess Everett at Politico got to cover the Supreme Court nomination hearings for Brett Kavanaugh. Huge deal, right? But he also had to cover the other stuff that happened in the Senate today, which I learned from Mr. Everett's Twitter feed today included the Senate apparently passing a resolution today confirming that September is School Bus Safety Month. I had no idea. A couple of weeks ago, he also had this little scooplet. You could put this under the category of might be important, might not, but I saw it. Here it is. Mike Pence is having a very long chat with Democratic Senator Chris Coons. Might be something, might be nothing, but for the record, it was observed by a congressional beat reporter, and therefore it was reported. You also just sometimes get public-facing complaints about Congress. Quote, Dean Heller still won't talk to me. Or, it's no tie Wednesday for Bernie Sanders. See, I wouldn't have known that if we did not have beat reporters in national politics whose beat is Congress. Now, is it important? Might be. Sometimes, not always, but I'm glad somebody was there to report it and did so. And on July 19th, 7 weeks ago, Burgess Everett, congressional reporter for Politico.com, was apparently right outside Senator Dick Durbin's office in the Capitol. Because he's a congressional beat reporter, right? But for whatever reason, he ended up at that exact spot at a very opportune moment, and he was able to report this, quote, McConnell withdraws Bounds nomination. I can hear Democrats literally cheering in Senator Durbin's office. Now, that day in the U.S. Senate, Democrats were not going around in the halls openly cheering and celebrating what had just happened, but they apparently did burst into cheering behind closed doors that apparently were not thick enough to block shoe leather congressional reporters, at least one of them, from hearing them start to shout and celebrate inside Senator Durbin's office. What the Democrats were celebrating that day was this guy not becoming a judge. For everything else the Trump administration has proven itself incapable of doing, they have been just a juggernaut at confirming conservative judges. Republicans in the Senate under President Obama had a strategy about this. They held open every single judicial seat they could for as long as they could, including even a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. They just would not let the Obama White House put any federal judges through. And so in the Obama years, with Republicans in control of the Senate, the vacancies for judicial seats just mounted and mounted and mounted for years. And then having followed that strategy for years, Republicans finally got their payoff when a Republican president was elected, and they were ready. And they launched hundreds of conservative nominees all at once, all for lifetime appointments. And there were plenty of vacancies for them to fill because Republicans had held all those seats open. With control of the Senate, Republicans have been running those nominees through like factory-made chocolates on an out-of-control conveyor belt. Faster, faster, faster. It's almost like they think this administration might not last. So they've got to hurry through as many of these nominations as they can. But on July 19th, despite this well-oiled, if fairly frantic system, one of their judicial nominees failed. His name was Ryan Bounds. He was a conservative prosecutor in Oregon. The Trump administration nominated him to a federal appeals court, just one level below the U.S. Supreme Court. And again, in general, Republicans in the Senate have been ramming through Trump nominees by the fistful. But this Ryan Bounds nomination was stopped. And it was stopped because, number one, all Democrats in the Senate opposed him. Democrats were united in their opposition to Ryan Bounds. And number two, Senator Tim Scott also opposed him. Senator Tim Scott, the lone African-American Republican member of the United States Senate. Turns out this nominee had a robust, lengthy history of really inflammatory racial writings, none of which he had turned over to the Judiciary Committee when they were supposedly vetting him for a lifetime appointment to a federal appeals court. The nominee had also appointed himself, associated himself with some racially sort of crass stuff. When he was opinion editor of a conservative campus newspaper, for example, that paper started using this nice, angry Indian cartoon caricature to illustrate his section of the paper. They did that apparently, particularly because there had been a history of Native American groups objecting to that kind of insensitive racial caricature at that campus. I can say that from experience because I went to the same school as this guy at the same time, and I remember those fights. But despite the racially inflammatory stuff in this nominee's written record in his past, and despite the fact that he had apparently tried to hide those writings from the Senate, his nomination did appear to be on track to get confirmed through the Republican Senate anyway on what was expected to be a party line vote, until Senator Tim Scott decided he was not okay with this guy. He was not willing to vote for this judge who had publicly mused on Aryan student unions and what he called feel-good ethnic hoedowns and, quote, ethnic elites. According to Burgess Everett's reporting at the time in Politico.com, Senator Tim Scott started to voice his concerns and the possibility that he might vote no on this nominee just one day before the vote was scheduled on Ryan Bounds. Apparently, Senator Scott personally then spoke to the nominee himself to try to assuage his concerns. That did not work. Then Senator Scott reportedly went to talk to his friend, Senator Marco Rubio, about his concerns. The two of them together, Rubio and Scott, decided they would talk together to the nominee. They did so. That still did not work. Afterwards, Senator Tim Scott apparently said, nope, I am not doing it. You cannot have my vote for this nominee. Senator Marco Rubio then reportedly said, okay, if you're voting no, Senator Scott, then I will join you in that too. And that was all it took. Ryan Bounds' nomination died. And Burgess Everett was there to hear the Democrats cheering about it behind the doors of Senator Dick Durbin's office. That was 7 weeks ago. Republicans are in control of the U.S. Senate, obviously, but only barely. They only have a 51-49 majority. At the time of that Ryan Bounds nomination 7 weeks ago, that's when Senator John McCain was out sick. And so at that point, it wasn't 51-49, it was 50-49. That meant it would only take one Republican defection to sink any judicial nominee or any other vote of any kind in the Senate, as long as Democrats stayed unified in opposition. Well, now with Senator John McCain having passed, he's been replaced now by Senator John Kyle, who is now sworn in the Senate. Now it's back up to 51-49. But that still means if only two Republican senators peel off on any one vote or any one nomination, as long as the Democrats are unified, that vote or that nominee is toast. And now, after more than 31 hours of confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court this week, it is becoming clear that Democrats are proceeding on the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court with that very, very narrow vote margin in mind. There have been some, I think the way to say it, forgive me, I think there has been quite a lot of facile commentary. And I don't mean that to be snarky or mean to anyone in particular, but I think there's been a ton of facile commentary and some headlines that you might have seen suggesting that Democrats are trying to make a big spectacle out of the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation process because the Democrats are in the minority and there's therefore no way they can stop this nomination. So they're just setting off fireworks pointlessly to try to get attention and make a scene. And you've seen reporting and you've seen commentary that that's in particular what the Democrats have been doing with these stunts they've been pulling about releasing documents from Kavanaugh's history, documents that the Republicans say should be confidential. You know what? If Democrats were just trying to make a spectacle out of the Kavanaugh confirmation process, if they knew it was a futile effort, he was definitely going to be confirmed anyway, no matter what they did, if they just wanted to make a stink, there are easier and more fun ways to do that. That's not what they're doing. What's now become clear after these 3 long days of hearings is that the Democrats aren't just trying to make a spectacle of the confirmation process here. They appear to be actually trying to block Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation. They appear to be actually trying to win. Democrats are not used to seeing this in their elected officials, so I'm not sure this is being recognized widely coast to coast. But look at what they're doing. They're not just making sort of sound and fury here. They're doing something specific to try to win, to try to stop Kavanaugh's nomination. And they may not win. But I think it's worth being clear that that is what they're going for. They are apparently aware that it is sort of a close question here. For a number of reasons, right? This nominee is actually super unpopular. Nationwide polling shows that this nominee is less popular than any other modern Supreme Court nomination since Harriet Miers. The reason I'm not saying Justice Harriet Miers is because she never made it to the Supreme Court. She had to withdraw her nomination when it became clear that she had nowhere near enough support to proceed. Public support for Brett Kavanaugh's nomination is even lower than what Harriet Miers enjoyed before she had to withdraw. In at least one national poll, public support for Brett Kavanaugh's nomination is even lower than what we saw for Robert Bork, who also did not become a Supreme Court justice. Now, Judge Bork insisted on going all the way through to a vote and not withdrawing the way that Harriet Miers did. But Bork was rejected by a fairly large bipartisan majority in the Senate. That was a failed nomination because he didn't have enough support. Brett Kavanaugh's public support is lower than what Robert Bork had when he failed to get confirmed. And public support isn't everything, right? The public doesn't get a direct vote on Supreme Court nominees. But it is striking in this case that support is so low for Kavanaugh. And ultimately, that kind of thing does end up mattering to senators if they have reason to really seriously consider their vote here. Ultimately, it does matter to elected officials, particularly right before an election, when more Americans don't want Brett Kavanaugh confirmed than do want him confirmed. And in national polling, Brett Kavanaugh is underwater that way. More people want him rejected than want him confirmed. And in that environment, with a weak and unpopular nominee, having been chosen for the position by a weak and unpopular president, who has been named as an unindicted co-conspirator in a criminal felony case and is at the center of a huge counterintelligence and criminal investigation that is literally going to result in one of his campaign aides being sentenced probably to prison tomorrow in the middle of Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings while jury selection proceeds for his campaign chairman who has already been convicted on 8 felony counts and is up for more. I mean, in that environment, with a weak and unpopular nominee nominated by a weak and unpopular and endangered president, and with a razor-thin Republican majority in the Senate, Democrats are not throwing up their hands and being like, we got no choice here, we got no chance, can't do nothing, let's just make noise. I mean, Democrats have one small specific task this week, and it is not to change the world's perception of Brett Kavanaugh or the world's perception of President Trump or to somehow transform the Republican caucus in the Senate somehow. No, all they need to do is peel off 2 Republican senators, persuade them to decide, for their own reasons, that they can't vote for this man. What Democrats are doing here is not a turn on the sprinkler strategy. This is an aim the squirt gun strategy. For example, there are 2 Republican senators who say they are pro-choice, who have made clear to their constituents back home for years, actually in both of their cases for decades, that they will not provide the vote that leads to overturning Roe versus Wade and making abortion illegal. Up until now, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Senator Susan Collins of Maine have indicated that they are satisfied with Brett Kavanaugh saying he views Roe versus Wade as settled law.
We talked about whether he considered Roe to be settled law. He said that he agreed with what Justice Roberts said at his nomination hearing, in which he said that it was settled law. We had a very good, thorough discussion about that issue and many others that matter.
Senator Susan Collins of Maine, one of two Republican pro-choice senators, the other is Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, saying there, with apparently indicating some satisfaction, that Brett Kavanaugh told her that he considered Roe versus Wade to be settled law. That, by Susan Collins' own admission, is something that is important to her, something that matters to her in terms of her vote on this nomination. Well, today, somebody leaked to the New York Times and then to NBC News this email written by Brett Kavanaugh in 2003, in which he argues explicitly that Roe versus Wade is not recognized to be settled law because the Supreme Court could very well overturn it. Quote, "I am not sure that all legal scholars refer to Roe as the settled law of the land at the Supreme Court level, since court can always overrule its precedent." And 3 current justices on the court would do so. At the time Brett Kavanaugh was writing that in 2003, he was probably right that 3 justices on the court then would have voted to overturn Roe. Right now, there are certainly 4 justices who are expected to be votes to overturn Roe, and Judge Brett Kavanaugh is widely believed to be the long-awaited 5th vote to do just that if they ever put him on the court. So that email, first made public today, despite it being stamped confidential by the Republicans, it raises a few questions. First of all, why was that email marked confidential and not released to the public? What about that was inappropriate for the public to know about Judge Kavanaugh and his views? I mean, that was him commenting on a proposed op-ed. What's the national security sanctity of a proposed op-ed? That means we all need to be protected from his suggested edits to that document. But also, how do senators like Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins look at that and explain to their constituents that they're still confident that he'll treat Roe as settled law, that there's no chance he believes that it could even be overturned, when it's there in black and white that he doesn't believe it's settled law at all, that he absolutely thinks it could be overturned? Again, what Democratic senators appear to be pursuing here is not a broadcast strategy to persuade the public, right? To persuade the media. The strategy around releasing the Roe memo, and I say it's a Democratic strategy because NBC News said explicitly today that when they got it from, quote, Democratic sources. This strategy is aimed at 2 specific Republican senators. It has an audience, a very specific audience. And those 2 senators have admitted that they will base their vote in part on that issue. I mean, whether or not anybody else is moved or persuaded about the certainty of Kavanaugh's vote to make abortion illegal, right? Whether or not this memo persuades anybody about that. The key question is whether Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins are persuaded by the release of this memo. Hawaii Senator Mazie Hirono also thwarted the confidentiality that Republicans tried to assert on Kavanaugh's documents by releasing this one from Kavanaugh's time in the George W. Bush White House in 2002. This is Brett Kavanaugh writing June 4th, 2002, to another White House official, quote, "I think the testimony needs to make clear that any program targeting Native Hawaiians as a group is subject to strict scrutiny and of questionable validity under the Constitution." Now, that is a very specific issue. Why would Mazie Hirono be going out on a limb as a senator to break the supposed confidentiality of these documents in order to release this specific document from Brett Kavanaugh's past? It's not on a lot of different issues. It's specific to this one thing. It's that one statement, basically, is the document. Now, is this kind of an issue going to turn the national tide against Brett Kavanaugh? No. That specific document might not even garner a single national headline when it comes to Brett Kavanaugh. But you don't need to turn the tide. You don't need to turn the whole country. You need 2 votes. You need to turn 2 Republican senators. And so who is Mazie Hirono targeting here? She's not being subtle about it. She's very much spelling it out. When she announced that she was releasing this document, quote, "I referred to a committee confidential document where Judge Kavanaugh questioned the validity of programs that benefit Native Hawaiian programs and, by extension, Alaska Natives." And in case it's still not clear enough that this Democratic effort is specifically targeted, specifically designed, narrowcast, to make it impossible for Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski to vote for this nominee, Mazie Hirono really is willing to put that fine a point on it.
I think you have a problem here. Your view is that Native Hawaiians don't deserve protections as Indigenous people under the Constitution. And your argument raises a serious question about how you would rule on the constitutionality of programs benefiting Alaska Natives. I think that my colleagues from Alaska should be deeply troubled by your views.
my colleagues from Alaska. So we've got Democrats giving Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski a reason to vote no on Kavanaugh by showing that Kavanaugh actually doesn't think Roe versus Wade is settled law. They've both said that specific aspect of his record is key to their vote. In addition, we've got Lisa Murkowski getting another reason to vote no. Mazie Hirono taking it upon herself to expose to the public this document that shows that Lisa Murkowski might have a real problem back home with the considerable Alaska Native vote in her home state if she votes for this nominee who's absolutely on the record hostile to programs that benefit them or recognize them. And you might have seen this morning Mazie Hirono's announcement that she had released these documents. It came right after Senator Cory Booker stopped the show today when he announced that he was willing to risk expulsion from the Senate, if necessary, to release documents that, again, had inexplicably been marked confidential and hidden from the public. The ones he wanted to release included Kavanaugh's communications about racial profiling and affirmative action. Thanks to that action by Democrats in the Senate, we now have this document. Here's Brett Kavanaugh in 2001 calling affirmative action, quote, a naked racial set-aside. And he was not just opining in general. This is him talking about a Department of Transportation program that's supposed to benefit minority-owned contractors for getting government contracts. He calls it a, quote, naked racial set-aside. He's also on the record calling a government program for Native Hawaiians a, quote, naked racial spoils system. It's almost like when Judge Ryan Bounds wrote about the ethnic elites. Except, oh wait, Ryan Bounds never became a judge, because Republican Senator Tim Scott and maybe even Republican Senator Marco Rubio decided they could not stomach that kind of past writing on race for a judicial nominee. And they decided that just a few weeks ago. And that nomination failed. And at least one reporter heard the Democrats cheering. They don't need them all. They don't need the media. They don't need, they don't need to entertain any of us. They just need 2 votes. And those no votes can be for any reason at all that's important to those 2 Republican senators. So the Democrats did blow up the process again a little bit today by calling Republicans bluff on what Kavanaugh documents could be shown to the public. But it's not a blind eruption of some kind designed to get attention. When you look at the stuff they're releasing and the way they're releasing it and presenting it in these hearings, it's clear this is a very tightly targeted effort to speak meaningfully to specific Republican senators who really might have concerns with specific substantive elements of Brett Kavanaugh's record that would otherwise not have been let out of committee and would not have made it into the newspaper. I mean, for the most part, it appears that the Republican senators who are really being targeted here in this effort are not senators who are members of the Judiciary Committee. So when Democrats release these documents that have been marked committee confidential, those are documents that otherwise wouldn't have been seen by anybody off the committee. When they're releasing these documents, that may be the only way they can let Senator Tim Scott know that Brett Kavanaugh says affirmative action is a naked racial set-aside. That may be the only way they can let Senator Lisa Murkowski know what Brett Kavanaugh would do to Native Alaskans. That may be the only way they can lay it out as clearly as possible for Senator Lisa Murkowski and Senator Susan Collins that Brett Kavanaugh really doesn't think that Roe is settled law. He really does think the court could overturn that. It's not just noise here. There is a melody. There is a method to what they are doing. And alongside that, there are 2 other things going on here that we're going to talk about over the course of this evening. Number 1 is this now quite robust Democratic effort to show that on not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but as many as 5 different subjects, Brett Kavanaugh may have lied to the Senate in his last appearance before them when he was first up for confirmation as a judge more than 10 years ago. Democrats have been probing around the edges of that allegation since Kavanaugh was named as a nominee to the High Court. Today, they started laying out the proof. We'll have more on that coming up. And then, in addition, there is the drama that has been unleashed by California Senator Kamala Harris.
Judge, have you ever discussed Special Counsel Mueller or his investigation with anyone?
Well, it's in the news every day.
Have you discussed it with anyone?
With other judges, I know.
Have you discussed Mueller or his investigation with anyone at Kasowitz, Benson, and Torres, the law firm founded by Mark Kasowitz, President Trump's personal lawyer?
Uh,
Be sure about your answer, sir.
Well, I'm not remembering, but if you have something you want to,
Are you certain you've not had a conversation
said
with
I-
anyone at that law firm?
Kasowitz, Benson.
Kasowitz, Benson, and
Yeah.
Torres, which is the law firm founded by Mark Kasowitz,
Yeah.
who is President Trump's personal lawyer. Have you had any conversation about Robert Mueller or his investigation with anyone at that firm? Yes or no?
Well, is there a person you're talking about?
My question is, have you had a conversation with anyone at that firm about that investigation? It's a really specific question.
I would like to know the person you're thinking of, because what if
I
there's,
think you're thinking of someone and you don't want to tell us. Who did you have a conversation with at the
I'm not going to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to raise an objection here. This town is full of law firms. Law firms are full of people.
First of all, I'd like you to
Hold on.
pause the clock. Thank you.
The clock is paused.
Thank you.
That was the cliffhanger that we were left with at the end of last night's questioning of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh. Ooh, where did that come from? What does that mean? Well, Senator Kamala Harris has just had another round of questioning with Brett Kavanaugh. She went back to him again on that tonight. We've got that ahead for you in just a moment. And then we think, depending on what happens in that hearing room, we think we may have Senator Harris joining us live tonight on this show. Stay with us.
The topics we cover on MSNBC every day, they're driven by big ideas, big themes, huge societal changes. And that's what we talk about on our new podcast. It's called Why Is This Happening?
Why Is This Happening with Chris Hayes. New episodes every Tuesday. The full video podcast is no longer available, but The Rachel Maddow Show still is. Check out the full episode audio podcast or watch the show online anytime at now.msnbc.com.